Welcome back. Our special programming on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 continues with this special debate. September the 11th, 2001, the day the world changed forever, the day some 3,000 innocent people were killed by a devastating terror attack planned by Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. There's been a solemn remembrance at Ground Zero where the 110-story twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center were hit by two hijacked passenger jets. The victims at the Pentagon were also honored in a similar solemn ceremony, and a third hijacked jet was crushed into the heart, that was supposed to be crashed into the heart of the US Defense and Intelligence area. That was the Pentagon, of course. These events triggered some 20 years of conflict with Afghanistan, with the loss of 2,500 US soldiers, 66,000 Afghan soldiers, and 50,000 civilians. Those figures are conservative. It's estimated that there could have been many more. Our guests to discuss the world since 9/11, and of course the issues raised by our special documentary too. Here in the studio is Scott Hillier, founder and president of the European Independent Film Festival. Scott, though, was at the Twin Towers on September the 11th. Scott will tell us about that. He was then filming a documentary, which was eventually called The Twin Towers. It won an Oscar in 2002. Scott, thank you for being with us. Our correspondent at the Pentagon is Kerevan Gorgistani, of course, our Washington correspondent, who'll be giving us more about what happened there today. Of course, the third hijacked jet on September the 11th was flown into the Pentagon, the heart of US defense and intelligence. Kerevan has been there throughout the day observing the events, the commemorations that have taken place to the memory of 184 people who were killed then. Kerevan, can I bring you in first to give us a sense of what has been said there where you are and how people are on this very solemn day?
Well, the ceremonies here actually really begun at sunrise when they unfurled that giant U.S. flag on the west side of the Pentagon, right where that plane crashed into the building. That's how the day kicked off. And then there was a ceremony of observance with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, as well as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, and several dozens of generals and of people who worked or still work at the Pentagon. The two men actually spoke after that minute of silence, which was held, of course, at 9:37 a.m., which was the exact time that plane crashed into the building. And both of them spoke of the threats of the past and the threats of the present and looking forward. They both of them mentioned how this building was built during the Second World War. It started being built in 1941, and how it was built to protect the United States from those outside threats at the time, the Nazis, then the communists. But they also talked about the current terror threat coming from Al-Qaeda, from ISIS, and from the Taliban. They mentioned the Taliban, a group that the U.S. has been cooperating with over the past few weeks, of course, as that American longest war has been coming to an end. And the Americans are continuing to work, of course, with those Talibans. But the two men also spoke about what mission the people who came to the Pentagon, who were working there in 2001, what was their mission. Their mission was to protect the Republic and to uphold and defend the ideals of the United States across the world. Those ideals, of course, freedom, democracy, and they said that mission continues today. And the people who are still in this building, who remember their fallen comrades, but who work hard and sometimes who give their lives, the soldiers, the thousands of soldiers who have died since 9/11, defending the country abroad. And so they spoke about how that threat is still ongoing and how the battle to protect and defend the ideals of the United States continues and will continue for years to come.
Kerevan, bear with us. I'll just bring in Scott, and then obviously we'll come back to you as and when. Kerevan Gorgistani at the Pentagon. Scott, Kerevan describing the move there. As you were there on the day, can you tell us a little bit about sort of what you saw, what you witnessed?
Yeah, I mean,
years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? It's just hard to imagine it was 20 years ago. Obviously, I was there when the towers came down, and there's very few times in my life. I'm a war cameraman, so I've been to a lot of wars and stuff like that. But I took my eye off the viewfinder filming the buildings when they came down, because I was trying to get into them, because I had friends in the New York City Police Department and the New York Fire Department to try and get in, and we were going to go to the top of those buildings and
because you were
put the
filming
fires.
ostensibly a documentary about them.
Well, a series on them, yeah. So, I was trying to get in because I knew they were in there trying to put those fires out. That was their job. And it was horrific to see them come down and then just to be so scared for the rest of the day, because we didn't know whether there were going to be 200 planes coming in. We just didn't know. Nobody knew anything. And it was when you see something that's so shocking that it puts you backwards. And this is this thing, you watch horror movies and Hollywood movies, and you see people panic. I was obviously close enough to see the physical panic. But when we got back further enough, you just saw a nation of people, New York City is the capital of the world. They just got together and went, you did this to us. And you just see people just like unite and come together and go, you cannot do this to us. The initial panic of being underneath them when they came down, I get that. But we just saw the solidification of a city, then a nation, and then certain parts of the world. But I think, 20 years of that, I think it's obviously a different feeling now. The solidification has sort of disintegrated. And, to watch the Taliban come in unopposed into Kabul, you just can't help but think for those young men and women that went there for the last 20 years, and if they did survive, they've still got stuff up here and, physically injured. I mean, it's horrific.
Let me pause you there. Let me bring Kedevan back in briefly. Kedevan, the Pentagon where you are now, 20 years ago, the people inside that building must have felt they were in the safest place possible. Have you sensed any kind of feeling about that in this day?
Well, it's hard to tell, but of course, when you're working at the Defense Department of the United States, and when you see this big, huge building, you do feel that there is a sense of safety. And of course, that sense of safety was shattered on that day in 2001. But a lot of those people, of course, are people who have been in the military, who either had served or were going to serve, people who had been to wars, who had experienced wars abroad, but not on their home soil, that they had not seen that threat or that attack on them where they were going to work like everyone does on any given morning. And there was a video put out by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Hicks, who was in the Pentagon that day. She was working there 20 years ago, and she actually described how she was on the other side of the building, so far away from the impact site, and that she had her 2-year-old son at the time who was in the daycare there in the building, in the Pentagon, and that her first thought, of course, was to go grab her child to get out of the building. But she described something that maybe is linked to the fact that this is a military facility with people who are in the military. And she said, she described as she was going to get her child, how people were panicked but remained orderly and remained calm enough to think about their colleagues, their friends, and look out for each other as they were trying to exit this building, which is really a maze that has several floors, several corridors with different access points. And so all of that took place in a building where they indeed felt safe. And I believe that if you look at it today, 20 years later, of course, this building has been rebuilt, that west side has been rebuilt, and there is that giant flag today covering that impact site. But it is the Pentagon of the United States, the Department of Defense, where all these wars have been organized, have been led from, and therefore there is a sense of that security. But I guess that the people who were here on September 11th, 2001 know that that sense of safety is, of course, very relative.
Kedevan, thank you very much indeed. Kedevan Gorgistani, who's at the Pentagon, where 184 people lost their lives 20 years ago. That's out of the 3,000 or more who were killed during 9/11. Let's listen now to the US President Joe Biden speaking a few moments ago.
Unity is what makes us who we are. America at its best. To me, that's the central lesson of September 11th. It's that at our most vulnerable, in the push and pull of all that makes us human, in the battle for the soul of America, unity is our greatest strength.
He is our greatest strength. Joe Biden speaking 24 hours ago. He's speaking right now. We'll bring you that when we possibly can. Unity being the greatest strength. George W. Bush really bemoaning the fact that the US is divided today, Scott. And he spoke earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the America of 2001 versus right now is just, you know, we're talking left and right to the nth degree. And it's not a good thing. It's definitely not a good thing, particularly now that, you know, they're going to pull back. They're going to pull back their troops. It's going to be Fortress America again. They say they're not going to go back and fight all these wars that they've been in. You know, they're in Somalia. You know, they're in Somalia. They're in Africa. They're in Asia. Whether they do all that, but then you're going to have a lot of people back in the country that they don't know what side they're going to go on. And I mean, I think the one common threat was Al Qaeda. And they went there, and, you know, I have to say that I think George W. Bush split that by going to Iraq. And there was a foggy war over here. There was this war here. And, you know, Afghanistan is called the dustbin of empires for a reason. You know, that's where they go down.
Yeah. Scott, thank you. Let's bring in our third guest, who's now ready to join us. Tahir Abbas is Associate Professor in Terrorism and Political Violence at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at the Leiden University in The Hague. Tahir, thanks for being with us. We saw in our documentary which preceded this debate the issues regarding the Afghanistan operation, the issues regarding Iraq and what happened. Can I start by asking you a very, very big question? The USA, is it safer today than it was then?
Well, as mentioned just now, I think there are perhaps internal problems in the USA which were not imagined conceivable 20 years ago. And of course, the war on terror that began after the events of 9/11 was for a particular purpose. But in many ways, it's destabilized many parts of the world, the Middle East, South Asia, ongoing conflicts. And perhaps it might not have been as successful as we look back thinking about it now. Well, does that make America safer today? Well, America has relatively porous borders, particularly in the South. But I think America today has more internal problems than external.
And in terms of the things that were said in our documentary out here, with, for instance, Paul Bremer talking about the Iraq operation wasn't a failure, he said. Basically, he pointed to the fact that the GDP is better, infant mortality it's a better situation, life expectancy is better. Does that add up to it wasn't a failure, the Iraqi operation?
I mean, I think we can selectively pick facts here and there, but I think the Bremer episode suggested that the de-Baathification of the army was quite a disaster, and the plans to rebuild Iraq, reconstitute it after the invasion, were not well prepared at all. So some of the implications today in that part of the world, in Iraq and its neighboring countries, we have to go back to those early phases and what the destabilization did to Iraq and its neighboring countries and the lingering effects we still see today. I mean, I think it would be very difficult to describe the invasion of Iraq overall as any kind of success.
Tahir Abbas, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to Keravan Gorgistani, who's at the Pentagon, where there's been, of course, a solemn remembrance of the people who died there when the third aircraft was crashed into at the very heart of US intelligence and security. Keravan, on a broader sense, obviously with your hat as our Washington correspondent now, I mean, in terms of how the US is prepared to face the next 10 years, the next 20 years, thinking is changing. Are tactics changing as well? We have a change of administration with Biden coming in. Previously, obviously, under Donald Trump, it was kind of America first and bringing things back towards US borders and basically sort of making the US have a smaller role in the world. Is that set to continue? Will things change, do you think? What are the signs that you're detecting?
Well, that is at least the will of Joe Biden. He has repeated it over and over again, especially when defending his decision to withdraw fully from Afghanistan. He said that the threat of foreign terrorism today was not the same as it was back in 2001, that it had metastasized across the world in very different areas, and that focusing solely on Afghanistan and the nearby region was no longer the way to do it, and that that threat, though, was still alive and well, but that the U.S. could deal with that threat with over-the-horizon operations, meaning from outside of Afghanistan without having boots on the ground. That issue is true, but at the same time, some critics here in the United States say that that only works if you have the intelligence to guide those over-the-horizon operations, and that without any boots on the ground, without any intelligence on the ground, that becomes very difficult. The other thing that Joe Biden has said that he wants to do is to turn his focus to other threats, to different types of threats, not necessarily Islamist terrorism that was the focus over the past 20 years. And on that note, he is in line with some of what we've been hearing here from officials in the United States, starting, of course, with former U.S. President George Bush when he did that speech in Shanksville a little bit earlier today. He spoke about the threat of foreign terrorism, but said that that threat was no longer the biggest threat to the United States, that the threat was now coming from within. He, of course, was alluding to the threat of white nationalist terrorism inside the United States. And he said that while these two types of terrorism had different cultures, were from different cultural backgrounds, they were the children of the same foul spirit. And on that note, he is supported by U.S. intelligence. There was a report earlier this year that came out saying that the #1 threat to the U.S. homeland today was a white nationalist violence across the United States. And it looks like the goal, at least, is to try to shift the focus, all this surveillance apparatus, all these agencies working in the United States, to try to shift a little bit the focus to that domestic threat, as opposed to keeping the focus solely on foreign threats.
Keravan, thank you very much indeed. Keravan there talking about George W. Bush. Let's hear the words then straight from the horse's mouth. Let's listen to former President Bush.
In the weeks and months following the 9/11 attacks, I was proud to lead an amazing, resilient, united people. When it comes to the unity of America, those days seem distant from our own. Malign force seems at work in our common life that turns every disagreement into an argument, and every argument into a clash of cultures. So much of our politics has become a naked appeal to anger, fear, and resentment. That leaves us worried about our nation and our future together.
Let's go back to Tahir Abbas, who's the Associate Professor in Terrorism and Political Violence at Leiden in The Hague. The idea that the US, Tahir, wants to move away from the threat of Islamist terrorism, isn't that really something that's going to be dictated perhaps more by what those terrorists do rather than what the US government wants to do? And will what happens in Afghanistan between now and the next 10 years really dictate whether that happens or not?
I think there are a series of unknown scenarios that you just painted there. We don't really know what's going to happen to Afghanistan by way of its reconstitution now under the Taliban. We don't know what kinds of relations it would have with its neighbors and what that will mean for its own sovereignty and independence. And of course, the Islamist threat isn't going to disappear altogether because there's been a situation of change in Afghanistan. And of course, the disbanding of what was known as Islamic State doesn't mean that's effectively the end of Islamic State. Some of these conflicts will go on, and a lot of these conflicts go on because of existing ongoing issues as a result of previous wars, and they're not able to resolve themselves easily enough. And so these conflicts rage on with instability and external influences and different regional actors meddling in local affairs. So it's mired in complexity, but with this, it's still a great deal of a lack of certainty as to what might be the biggest set of threats going forward. But for sure, right now, and across Europe and in North America, we are looking at white nationalism as one of the biggest concerns.
Indeed. Tara Abbas, thank you for the moment. Thank you very much indeed. Let's come back to Scott Hillier here in the studio. Scott was at 9/11 when the dreadful events took place. Scott made a documentary about the Twin Towers winning an Oscar. And you have a shirt here, which I'm going to ask you to show us and tell us the story behind it, please.
So I shot a series for Dick Wolf, the man that makes Law and Order, and we spent 6 months with the New York City Emergency Services Unit, NYPD. So that's the thing there. Emergency Service Unit. That shirt belongs to Joe Vigiano, who was one of the 23 policemen who lost their lives on 9/11. He was the guy that I was trying to get into the towers to be with, and Joey died that day. One thing to you, what you just said then was the uncertainty of where we are. There was a lot of uncertainty that day. That was for sure. Again, we didn't know what was happening, how it was happened, but there was a binding and grinding together. I'm just going to tell a quick little story here.
Please,
because
go ahead.
Any chance that I can talk about Joe Vigiano is a big thing for me. Joe was the biggest meathead that you would ever imagine. He looked exactly like Vin Diesel. He was a big, bulky NYPD guy. To his own thing, he said he wasn't very clever, but all he wanted to do was catch bad guys. And Joey was 33 years of age, wounded 5 times in duty. Amazing guy. Of course, I loved him dearly. I thought he was amazing. And his father was one of the big police chiefs, big firefighter chiefs of New York City, and his older brother, John, went down the path of being a firefighter, where Joey went down the path of being a policeman. And on the 9/11, they were both in the towers doing what they did, which was protecting the New York City, and they both died. It was a horrific experience, and I tried desperately hard to be there, and if I had been there, maybe I'd be there, or maybe I would have got him out, one or the other. But I wear that shirt often on 9/11. Crazy things that people do. And there was one day about 10 years ago, I was sitting there in my office on a 9/11 day, sitting there, and I was searching for a pen, as I habitually do, because I lose them all the time. And I reached in the pocket of Joey's T-shirt, of his NYPD, and he had the patch, the firefighter's patch of his brother's unit.
So he had that in his actual
pocket,
shirt
in his pocket, and I didn't know that, and I guess not many people did, but I would imagine that he had the patch in there the day that both of them died. So that's the personal side of it.
Great, brave people. Scott, thank you. Kedevan, can I bring you back in? It's a day of great emotion, and obviously where you are, people perhaps don't show emotion normally at the Pentagon. It's a place of perhaps where people are very straight-faced. But on a day like today, I imagine that many people's emotional regard was slightly more open than usual.
Yes, this is, of course, as you mentioned, the Department of Defense. You have a lot of military personnel, and they tend to be a little bit more put together than maybe the rest of us, or they have a different strength, not showing their emotions. But when you listened to Lloyd Austin, who, before being Secretary of Defense, was a general, he served in Afghanistan. Then you had also the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, both accomplished military men who really, you could feel their emotion in their speeches, because, of course, like all Americans, including myself, we all remember exactly where we were when those first planes hit the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001. We all know exactly how we felt, how we found out, what our reactions were that day, how the day unfolded. And we also all remember how it changed our lives before and after September 11th. And I think one of the things that they focused on, at least here at the Pentagon, but I heard a few parts of the different speeches in the two other sites, there was this thought about the future, the thought about this new generation. And Lloyd Austin actually spoke about that. He said there are nearly a quarter of the American population that is too young to remember 9/11, that wasn't even born on 9/11, 2001. And these commemorations are for the deceased, but they're also a way, of course, to never forget what happened and to teach this generation that grew up after 9/11, who don't remember a time when there were no real security checks at the airports, who don't remember a time where terrorism was such a direct threat to them. And so this speech by Lloyd Austin also focused on that, on keeping the memory alive and learning from what happened and continuing the fight and continuing to talk about what happened and to teach those younger generation about what happened on 9/11 and how much it shaped the next decades of the United States and probably will continue to change in the future.
Kedevan, thank you. We've got so much to discuss. Let's, before we continue this talking, hear from, well, the very latest from President Biden.
And, you know, I know you've heard me say it before, and I'll probably get criticized for saying it again, but these memorials are really important, but they're also incredibly difficult for the people who are affected by them, because it brings back the moment you got the phone call. It brings back that instant you got the news, no matter how many years go by. So I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking of all the people. When I was down at the Rock, talking to a number of family members who lost somebody. You know, think about it.
Biden backing up what Kedevan was just saying, echoing what Scott was saying in the studio. Let's bring in Tahrir, who's joining us from the Netherlands. Tahrir Abbas, Associate Professor in Terrorism and Political Violence at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. Tahrir, you've been listening to what everyone's saying here. Does the importance of remembering these things and passing on the message to younger people growing up in the West, will it have an opposite effect on the people growing up not in the West, other places, Afghanistan, for instance? What do you think?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I'd only be speculating. Obviously, it's important to commemorate the events and to remember the tragedy so that we understand the cost of human lives. But we shouldn't draw equivalences. I think there's been a lot of that going on today. That, of course, we had the war on terror. We had thousands, hundreds of thousands of people displaced in the Middle East, especially since then, and lots of people have lost their lives all over the world as a result of what came after. So it's important to try and put this in context. However, obviously, we need to remember, we need to be reminded that certain kinds of acts of violence are unforgettable, and that we need to be remembering this as a human issue, and for all of us who are affected by this, whether we like it or not, we have to remember that there is a human cost element to this.
Indeed, that human cost element. We always talk about the near 3,000 that were killed at 9/11. In Afghanistan, we talk about the numbers. I've got some numbers written down here. You won't be surprised to learn. I'm seeing 2,500 US troops. We seldom hear about the 66,000 Afghan troops, and there's something like 50,000 civilians. And I suspect those figures are fairly conservative. I suspect they might be a lot higher in terms of what has happened. Do you think, Tahrir, that the idea of political violence, the idea of expressing themselves through this kind of thing is going to actually mean that the idea of terrorism will continue to grow within the borders of Afghanistan?
Yeah, terrorism always exists because there's a particular message that the terrorists want to provide, but terrorism never exists in a vacuum. There's always a story, there's a backstory. And if we continue to see instability, lack of governance, and disorganization in Afghanistan, which has been mired in conflict for 40 plus years, I mean, the civil war before the Soviet invasion in 79. So it needs a lot of rebuilding, and I think the international community should try and give the Taliban a bit of a chance before perhaps taking a tougher line when required. But it has been a country that's suffered numerously over the last few decades, and it's going to take a long time to get it back in order.
Indeed. I think we hear what you're saying. I think some people might be sort of taking issue with that, looking at the way that people are being treated and how women are being treated. But I think I get what you're saying, Tahrir, that you have to maybe give whoever is in charge the chance to sort of rebuild and hope that in some way those other issues can be dealt with by I don't know, back-channel negotiations with the likes of the US or Russia or maybe China. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking would actually be the best way forward in terms of helping Afghanistan develop?
Well, we realize that the Americans have pulled out, but they haven't pulled out that far. I mean, some of the bases have been reestablished in Central Asia, so they're in the vicinity, and there will be some cooperation behind the scenes, and there has been when it came to removing the last of the rebel strongholds in the north. So it's not the end of engagement with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not off the eyes and radar of the West. There will be some back channels for sure going forward. And the whole question around building democracy and introducing women's rights, I think the liberal West has put that forward considerably, but over the 20 years, we still have no more than 2% of women in higher education. And that's only in the very central areas among elite groups. So yeah, let's see what we can do by way of giving Afghanistan a bit of a chance. I think it's had a rough time for long enough.
Taria, thank you very much indeed. Final word from Kedevan at the Pentagon. Is there a sense where you are, Kedevan, that this is going to go forward, that the US will play a part? If you could be brief, I'd be grateful.
Well, they have said that they are waiting to see what the Taliban is going to do, not what it says. And so far, they have refused to say whether they will recognize or not recognize the Taliban government. But they're keeping the door open right now to see how things unfold in the coming weeks, in the coming months, before they make a decision. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier in that speech by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he clearly stated the Taliban as one on his list of enemies abroad for the United States. So it's going to be interesting to see how the United States deals with having to cooperate, to work with a group that they have seen for the past 20 years as their enemy.
Kedevan Gorgistani at the Pentagon, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring the final word to Scott Hillier here in the studio. Scott, founder of the European Independent Film Festival, but I'll remind you, Scott was a news cameraman, war cameraman, and present at the Twin Towers on the day of the bombing, filming a documentary. That documentary got an Oscar. It was called Twin Towers, Oscar in 2002. Check it out. Scott, you've brought in a shirt of your good friend who got killed. His brother got killed too. You lost people. You feel the emotion today. What are your final thoughts?
Well, I mean, again, it's a very hard day. I'll be very quick because I know we're on time.
No, you can take your time. Go ahead.
But I think that, we got to look back at this. That day was a very hard day, and a lot of people have had hard days afterwards, directly related to that. But I'm going to throw my Middle Eastern hat on here. I lived out there and worked out there a lot. Let's put ourselves in their shoes. 20 years later, time is on their side, and they've won. They've won. They've pulled out. America is in disorder. Let's just deal, not just Europe. Let's talk about America right now. They're in disorder. President Bush is now talking about the gravest threat for them is not external terrorism, it's interior terrorism. These guys are sitting back there going, wow, we've kicked them out. What's going to happen in America? Are they going to put drones, the drones that they had in Afghanistan, on people on a watch list in America? I do not believe so, but I know there's guys over there in caves in Afghanistan that are looking at going, well, they're not here.
There's already been the drone attack after the attack on Kabul airport, which was targeting supposedly an ISIS K operative. It turned out perhaps that wasn't necessarily the case.
I think they're gonna walk out of Afghanistan and just say, halas, finished, and that's it. And those guys are going to go, okay, we've won. 20 years later, after I watched those towers come down, and I was petrified, by the way, and not just me. It was a very, very scary thing that changed the world. But I think there's a lot of people over there thinking that they've won, time's on our side, and we will win again. And America's in extreme disorder. I love it. I live there, but I think they're in extreme disorder. And a lot of people over there are like going, that's it. We've won this, and let's see where this goes. But I mean, Islamic terrorism is not based only in Afghanistan. I think that if we get hooked up by saying that Afghanistan is the place, I think we're not speaking the good things.
Other parts of the world, Sahel, Africa,
Europe. There's places in Europe. These guys are. We all know that. So there are foreign places, but they're in Europe as well.
Okay, Scott Hillier, thank you very much indeed. Scott Hillier, as we said, it was at Twin Towers on the day. Filmmaker, war cameraman. His documentary about the Twin Towers getting the Oscar in 2002. Thanks to our correspondent Kedevan Gorgistani at the Pentagon throughout the day, bringing us a sense of what's happening there, and of course a sense of everything politically in the US. And thanks also to Tahir Abbas, Associate Professor in Terrorism and Political Violence at at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. Tahir, thank you so much for your take and your interpretation on the issues raised by our documentary, of course, which you can see again on our website, france24.com. Thank you for watching, and our programming about 9/11 continues here on France 24.